The rain hammered against the cockpit windows as Captain Sarah Mitchell gripped the controls of her twin-engine aircraft, her knuckles white with concentration. Through the chaos of the storm, she could see the flashing lights of the Coast Guard vessel below, desperately signaling for help. 23 survivors clung to life rafts in the churning waters of the Gulf of Mexico, and she was their only hope. But just 48 hours earlier, Sarah had been told she would never fly again. "You're grounded, Mitchell." Effective immediately. The words still echoed in her mind as she fought against the hurricane-force winds that threatened to tear her. Aircraft apart. The Federal Aviation Administration had deemed her unsafe for commercial aviation, citing concerns about her emotional stability and inability to follow protocol. They had taken away her commercial pilot's license, her career, and her identity. But they couldn't take away her conscience. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's journey to this moment began 25 years earlier, when she was just 8 years old, standing in her grandfather's wheat field in rural Kansas. The sky stretched endlessly above them, painted in shades of amber and gold as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Her grandfather, a World War II bomber pilot, pointed to a small aircraft cutting through the evening air, its wings catching the last rays of sunlight. "See that plane, Sarah?" he said, his weathered hand resting on her shoulder. "That's freedom. Right there. The ability to rise above everything that tries to hold you down, to see the world from a different perspective. That's what flying is all about." From that moment, Sarah knew her destiny lay in the clouds. She spent her childhood building model airplanes, reading aviation magazines, and dreaming of the day she would earn her wings. Her bedroom walls were covered with posters of aircraft, from the Wright Flyer to modern commercial jets. She could identify the sound of different engines from miles away, and she knew the specifications of every aircraft in production. But the path to her dream was far from smooth. In the 1980s, commercial aviation was still very much a man's world. When Sarah enrolled in flight school at 18, she was one of only 3 women in a class of 47 students. The instructors were skeptical, her male classmates were dismissive, and the industry itself seemed determined to keep her on the ground. "Women don't have the physical strength to handle large aircraft," one instructor told her during her first week of training. "They're too emotional under pressure. Flying is a man's job." Sarah refused to let these attitudes defeat her. She studied harder than anyone else, spending countless hours in the simulator, memorizing flight manuals, and perfecting her technique. She learned to ignore the snickers when she walked into the hangar, the whispered comments about her appearance, and the constant questioning of her abilities. Her first solo flight was a revelation. As she lifted off from the runway in a small Cessna 172, feeling the aircraft respond to her touch, Sarah experienced a profound sense of belonging. The earth fell away beneath her, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly free. The noise and negativity of the world below faded into insignificance as she soared through the clear blue sky. "This is where I belong," she whispered to herself, banking the aircraft toward the setting sun. "This is what I was born to do." After graduation, Sarah faced another uphill battle. Airlines were reluctant to hire female pilots, citing concerns about passenger confidence and crew dynamics. She was rejected by 12 major carriers before finally landing a job with a small regional airline. The position came with a significant caveat: she would be closely monitored, and any deviation from protocol would result in immediate termination. For the next 15 years, Sarah flew without incident. She accumulated over 8,000 flight hours, earned her captain's rating, and built a reputation as one of the most skilled and reliable pilots in the industry. Passengers often commented on her smooth landings and calm demeanor during turbulent flights. Her colleagues respected her expertise, and she mentored dozens of young pilots, both male and female. But Sarah's career took a dramatic turn during a routine flight from Miami to Atlanta on a stormy Tuesday evening in March. Flight 447 was carrying 156 passengers when it encountered severe turbulence over the Florida Everglades. The aircraft was buffeted by powerful winds and heavy rain, causing panic among the passengers and crew. Following standard protocol, Sarah requested permission to climb to a higher altitude to avoid the worst of the storm. Air traffic control denied her request, citing heavy traffic in the area. As the turbulence intensified, Sarah made a split-second decision that would change her life forever. "I'm declaring an emergency and climbing to 35,000 feet," she announced over the radio, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "I have structural stress indicators and need to get above this weather immediately." The maneuver was successful. Sarah guided the aircraft through the storm and landed safely in Atlanta, where emergency crews were waiting. All 156 passengers and crew members walked away without injury. The aircraft sustained only minor damage from the turbulence, and Sarah's quick thinking had potentially saved hundreds of lives. But the Federal Aviation Administration saw it differently. They viewed Sarah's deviation from air traffic control instructions as a serious breach of protocol, regardless of the outcome. The investigation that followed was exhaustive and unforgiving. Sarah's every decision was scrutinized. Her psychological profile was analyzed, and her fitness for duty was questioned. The bureaucratic machine that valued compliance over courage was about to teach her a devastating lesson about the price of saving lives. 6 months after that stormy night over the Everglades, the hearing room in the Federal Aviation Administration building in Washington, D.C. felt more like a courtroom than a professional review. Sarah sat at a small table facing the panel of 5 officials, their faces stern and unforgiving. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the room, and the air conditioning hummed with mechanical indifference. This was where careers came to die. "Captain Mitchell," the lead investigator began, his voice carrying the weight of bureaucratic authority, "you deliberately violated air traffic control instructions during Flight 447. This action, regardless of its outcome, represents a fundamental breach of aviation safety protocols." Sarah had prepared for this moment for months. She had reviewed every regulation, consulted with aviation lawyers, and gathered testimony from passengers and crew members who credited her with saving their lives. But as she sat in that sterile room, facing the men who held her career in their hands, she felt the crushing weight of institutional bias. "Sir, I exercised emergency authority as pilot in command," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "The aircraft was experiencing severe structural stress, and I had seconds to make a decision that would ensure the safety of 156 souls on board. I followed the fundamental rule of aviation. The safety of the aircraft and its occupants supersedes all other considerations." The investigator shuffled through a stack of papers, his expression unchanged. "Captain Mitchell, your psychological evaluation indicates a pattern of impulsive decision-making and an inability to accept authority. Dr. Harrison's report suggests that you may be prone to emotional responses that could compromise flight safety." Sarah's jaw tightened. The psychological evaluation had been conducted by Dr. Richard Harrison, a man who had never flown an aircraft, but had built a career on declaring pilots unfit for duty. His questions had been invasive and biased, focusing more on her personal life and emotional state than her professional competence. "Dr. Harrison never asked about my 15 years of incident-free flying," Sarah responded. "He didn't inquire about my safety record, my training achievements, or my contributions to aviation safety. Instead, he focused on my decision to prioritize passenger safety over bureaucratic compliance." The second investigator, a woman who Sarah had hoped might understand her position, leaned forward. "Captain Mitchell, Aviation safety depends on adherence to established protocols. When pilots begin making unilateral decisions, regardless of their intentions, the entire system becomes compromised. We cannot allow personal judgment to override established procedures. Sarah felt a surge of frustration. "Ma'am, with respect." Every pilot training program emphasizes that the pilot in command has the ultimate responsibility for the safety of the aircraft. We're taught to use our judgment, to assess situations in real time, and to take decisive action when necessary. That's exactly what I did. The hearing continued for 3 hours, with each investigator taking turns questioning Sarah's decision-making process, her emotional stability, and her fitness for duty. They dissected every aspect of her career, from her early training to her recent performance evaluations. They questioned former colleagues about her behavior, analyzed her flight logs for patterns of non-compliance, and examined her personal life for signs of instability. The most damaging testimony came from Captain Robert Hayes, a veteran pilot who had served as Sarah's co-pilot on several flights. Hayes, who had been passed over for promotion to captain multiple times, painted a picture of Sarah as an erratic and unpredictable pilot who routinely disregarded safety protocols. "She always thought she knew better than everyone else," Hayes testified via video link. "She would make comments about air traffic control being incompetent, and she often expressed frustration with company policies. I was concerned about her emotional state on several occasions." Sarah's attorney, Maria Santos, a former pilot herself, fought back aggressively. She presented evidence of Sarah's exemplary safety record, her contributions to pilot training programs, and testimonials from hundreds of passengers whose lives she had touched. She highlighted the fact that Sarah's actions during Flight 447 had been validated by independent aviation safety experts. "Captain Mitchell made the right decision under extreme pressure," Santos argued. "She demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and leadership that we want in our commercial pilots. The fact that she's being punished for saving lives reveals a fundamental flaw in the system, not in her character. But the damage was done." The psychological evaluation, combined with Hayes' testimony and the bureaucratic preference for protocol over outcome, created a narrative that Sarah was an unstable pilot who posed a danger to aviation safety. The panel deliberated for less than an hour before returning with their verdict. "Captain Mitchell," the lead investigator announced, "after careful consideration of all evidence and testimony, this panel finds that you are unsuitable for commercial aviation. Your pilot in command certificate is hereby revoked, and you are banned from operating commercial aircraft. This decision is final and non-appealable." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had dedicated her entire adult life to aviation, sacrificing relationships, financial security, and personal happiness to pursue her dream of flight. Now, in a sterile government building, 5 strangers had decided that her career was over. As Sarah left the hearing room, she felt numb. The hallways of the FAA building stretched endlessly before her, filled with the quiet efficiency of bureaucracy. Other pilots passed her in the corridors, their faces carefully neutral, afraid that association with her might taint their own careers. She was now a pariah in the aviation community, a cautionary tale about the dangers of defying authority. News of her grounding spread quickly through the industry. Aviation blogs analyzed her case, pilot forums debated her actions, and the media portrayed her as either a hero or a reckless rule breaker, depending on their perspective. Several airlines publicly stated that they would not consider hiring her even if she managed to appeal the decision. But Sarah's story was far from over. She would continue to fly, license or no license, and soon the sky would call upon her for the most important mission of her life. What she didn't know was that in just 6 months, she would face a choice that would either vindicate her completely or destroy her forever. 6 months after losing her commercial pilot's license, Sarah found herself living in a small apartment. In Key West, Florida, working as a flight instructor at a local aviation school. The pay was minimal, barely enough to cover her rent and basic expenses, but it kept her connected to the world she loved. Every morning, she would walk to the small airport and watch the sun rise over the tarmac, feeling the familiar pull of the sky above. The irony wasn't lost on her. Despite being deemed unsafe for commercial aviation, she was still qualified to teach others how to fly. The Federal Aviation Administration had stripped her of her right to carry passengers commercially, but they couldn't take away her fundamental pilot's license or her instructor's rating. It was a cruel reminder of the arbitrary nature of bureaucratic decisions. Sarah's students were a diverse group: retired executives learning to fly for pleasure, young people pursuing aviation careers, and weekend warriors seeking the thrill of personal flight. She approached each lesson with the same dedication and precision that had made her a successful commercial pilot. Her students consistently passed their check rides on the first attempt, and her reputation as an instructor began to grow. But the ghost of her former life haunted her daily. Every time she saw a commercial airliner climb into the sky, she felt a sharp pang of loss. She would watch the aircraft disappear into the clouds and wonder about the captain at the controls, the passengers in the cabin, and the routine miracle of modern aviation that she was no longer part of. The aviation community in Key West was small and tight-knit. Most pilots knew Sarah's story, and opinions were divided. Some admired her courage in prioritizing passenger safety over bureaucratic compliance. Others believed she had gotten what she deserved for defying authority. The controversy followed her everywhere, a constant reminder of the price she had paid for her convictions. On the morning of September 15th, Sarah was conducting a routine training flight with a student pilot named Marcus, a young man pursuing his commercial license. They were practicing instrument approaches in a twin-engine Piper Aztec when the radio crackled with an urgent transmission. All stations, this is Coast Guard Air Station Miami with an emergency broadcast. Hurricane Isabella has unexpectedly intensified to Category 4 status and is approaching the Bahamas. A cruise ship, the Caribbean Star, has issued a distress call approximately 120 miles southeast of Nassau. The vessel is taking on water and has lost main propulsion. 700 passengers and crew are preparing to abandon ship. Sarah's hands tightened on the controls. She had been monitoring the hurricane's progress for days, watching as it slowly churned across the Atlantic. Weather forecasters had predicted it would remain a Category 2 storm, but nature had its own agenda. The sudden intensification had caught everyone off guard. Coast Guard is launching all available aircraft for search and rescue operations. The transmission continued. Due to the storm's intensity, we are requesting assistance from any qualified pilots with appropriate aircraft. This is a life or death situation. Marcus looked at Sarah with wide eyes. Are they really asking for civilian help? Sarah nodded grimly. When there are 700 people in the water, pride and protocol take a backseat to saving lives. The Coast Guard doesn't have enough aircraft to handle a rescue operation of this magnitude, especially in hurricane conditions. They returned to the airport immediately, where Sarah found the small terminal buzzing with activity. Pilots were gathered around weather computers, studying satellite images and wind reports. The hurricane was massive, with winds exceeding 150 miles per hour and a storm surge that could reach 20 feet. The eye wall was clearly visible on radar, a perfectly circular void surrounded by a wall of devastation. "It's suicide," muttered Captain Jim Torres, a charter pilot who had been flying in the Caribbean for 30 years. No aircraft can survive in those conditions. The Coast Guard is asking us to fly into a blender. Sarah studied the weather data with growing concern. The hurricane's path would take it directly over the area where the cruise ship was located. The passengers and crew would be forced to abandon ship in the middle of the storm, facing mountainous Waves and hurricane-force winds and nothing but life rafts and survival suits. "The Coast Guard can't wait for the storm to pass," she said to the assembled pilots. "By the time Isabella moves through, anyone in the water will be dead. This is a narrow window of opportunity." Most of the pilots shook their heads and walked away. They had families to return to, careers to protect, and lives to preserve. Flying into a Category 4 hurricane was beyond the scope of reasonable risk, even for experienced aviators. But Sarah couldn't walk away. She stood at the window of the terminal, watching the wind bend the palm trees and feeling the building shake with each gust. Somewhere out there, 700 people were facing the fight of their lives. Men, women, and children who had boarded a cruise ship for a vacation were now confronting their mortality in the middle of the ocean. She thought about her grandfather's words from all those years ago. Flying is about rising above everything that tries to hold you down. The Federal Aviation Administration had tried to hold her down, to convince her that she was unfit to fly. But in this moment, with lives hanging in the balance, she knew that her skills and experience were exactly what those people needed. Sarah made her decision. She would fly into the hurricane. The aircraft she chose was a modified Beechcraft King Air 350, owned by a local charter company. The twin-turboprop plane was known for its reliability and performance in challenging conditions. More importantly, it was equipped with weather radar, modern navigation equipment, and enough fuel capacity to reach the disaster area and return safely. As she began her pre-flight inspection, Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had sustained her through 15 years of commercial flying. The wind was already gusting to 40 miles per hour, and the hurricane's outer bands were beginning to reach the Florida Keys. In 6 hours, the storm would make landfall, bringing with it catastrophic winds and flooding. She had that long to save as many lives as possible. The aircraft she chose was a modified Beechcraft King Air 350, and as she began her pre-flight inspection, Sarah knew she was about to attempt something that would either make her a hero or cost her everything. What she didn't realize was that this flight would become the most important rescue mission in modern aviation history. The King Air 350's engines roared to life as Sarah completed her pre-flight checklist, their twin turboprops cutting through the increasingly violent wind. The aircraft shuddered against the powerful gusts, its wings flexing like a bird preparing for flight. Through the cockpit windows, she could see the darkening sky to the southeast, where Hurricane Isabella was building into a wall of destruction that stretched from the ocean surface to the stratosphere. "Tower, this is King Air November 7-4 Charlie. Requesting immediate departure to the southeast," Sarah transmitted, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. The air traffic controller's response came back immediately, tinged with concern. "King Air 7-4 Charlie, be advised that Hurricane Isabella is tracking directly through your requested route. Winds are reported at 140 knots with severe turbulence. Are you declaring an emergency?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Negative, Tower. I'm responding to the Coast Guard's request for search and rescue assistance. Caribbean Star has 700 souls in the water, and I'm one of the few pilots crazy enough to try to help them." There was a long pause before the controller responded. "King Air 7-4 Charlie, you are cleared for departure. Godspeed and good luck." As Sarah taxied to the runway, she felt the aircraft being pushed sideways by the wind. The palm trees around the airport were bent nearly horizontal, and debris was already beginning to fly through the air. She had perhaps 30 minutes before conditions became too dangerous, even for takeoff. The takeoff was violent. The moment the King Air left the ground, it was caught in a powerful updraft that launched it skyward like a missile. Sarah fought the controls as the aircraft climbed through layers of turbulence, each gust threatening to tear the wings from the fuselage. The radio crackled with transmissions from Coast Guard aircraft already en route to the disaster area. Coast Guard Rescue 6. This is Coast Guard Rescue 3. I'm encountering severe icing at flight level 180. Request immediate descent to avoid structural damage. Coast Guard Rescue 3. Descend and maintain flight level 120. Be advised that conditions are deteriorating rapidly. We may need to abort the mission if weather continues to worsen. Sarah climbed to 25,000 feet, trying to stay above the worst of the storm. Through breaks in the clouds, she could see the ocean below, its surface whipped into a frenzy of white caps and foam. The waves were already reaching 30 feet, and the hurricane was still hours away from reaching full intensity. As she flew southeast, Sarah's weather radar painted a terrifying picture. The hurricane's eye wall was clearly visible, a perfect circle of devastation surrounded by bands of intense precipitation and wind. The storm was enormous, covering an area larger than the state of Florida, and it was moving directly toward the location where the Caribbean Star was fighting for its life. This is Coast Guard Rescue 1 to all aircraft, came a transmission from the mission commander. Caribbean Star has reported that they are taking on water faster than pumps can handle. Captain estimates they have less than 2 hours before the ship becomes uninhabitable. Passengers are being moved to muster stations in preparation for abandon. Ship procedures. Sarah's heart sank. 2 hours meant that the passengers would be forced into the water just as the hurricane reached its peak intensity. Even with survival suits and life rafts, their chances of survival in 40-foot seas and 150-mile-per-hour winds were minimal. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As Sarah approached the outer bands of the hurricane, the turbulence became savage. The King Air was thrown around like a toy, climbing and descending thousands of feet in seconds. She had to constantly adjust power settings and control inputs to maintain even basic aircraft control. The stress on the airframe was enormous, and she could hear the aircraft groaning under the strain. King Air 74 Charlie, this is Coast Guard Rescue 1. What is your position and status? Coast Guard Rescue 1, I'm approximately 50 miles northeast of the Caribbean Star's last known position. Weather conditions are severe, but the aircraft is holding together. I'm equipped with emergency medical supplies and can take up to 12 survivors. Copy that, 74 Charlie. Be advised that we have multiple Coast Guard aircraft in the area, but several have been forced to return to base due to structural damage. The hurricane is intensifying faster than predicted. Sarah pressed on, flying deeper into the storm. The rain was so heavy that it completely obscured her view outside the cockpit. She was flying entirely on instruments, relying on GPS navigation and weather radar to guide her through the chaos. Lightning flashed continuously around the aircraft, illuminating the churning clouds and brilliant white light. At 4:30 p.m., Sarah's radio crackled with the transmission they had all been dreading. All stations, this is Caribbean Star. We are abandoning ship. Repeat, we are abandoning ship. 700 passengers and crew are entering the water at position 24 degrees, 15 minutes north, 77 degrees, 32 minutes west. Mayday, mayday. The moment of truth had arrived. Somewhere below, in the churning waters of the Atlantic Ocean, 700 people were fighting for their lives. The cruise ship that had been their refuge was now sinking beneath the waves, leaving them exposed to the full fury of Hurricane Isabella. Sarah descended through the storm layers, fighting massive downdrafts and wind shear that threatened to tear the aircraft apart. At 5,000 feet, she broke through the cloud base and saw a sight that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The ocean was a cauldron of white water and foam, with waves reaching 40 feet in height. Scattered across the surface were dozens of orange life rafts, each one containing desperate survivors clinging to life. The wind was so strong that it was blowing the tops off the waves, creating a horizontal wall of spray that reduced visibility to mere yards. Coast Guard Rescue 1. This is King Air 74 Charlie. I have visual contact with survivors. Count. Approximately 30 life rafts scattered over a 2-mile area. Conditions are beyond extreme. How copy? King Air 74 Charlie, we copy. Several of our aircraft have been forced to return to base due to structural damage. You may be the only rescue aircraft still operational in the area. Sarah's blood ran cold. She was alone in the hurricane, the only pilot still willing or able to attempt a rescue. The weight of responsibility was crushing, but she knew she couldn't abandon the people below. She had to find a way to save them, even if it meant sacrificing her own life in the process. Looking down at those desperate souls fighting against impossible odds, Sarah made a choice that would either save hundreds of lives or end her own. Flying at 200 feet above the churning ocean, Sarah could see the desperation in the life rafts below with crystal clarity. The orange inflatables were being tossed around like toys, disappearing completely into the troughs of massive waves before being launched skyward on the next crest. Through her binoculars, she could see people waving frantically, their faces pale with fear and exhaustion, some already showing signs of hypothermia despite the warm Caribbean waters. The King Air wasn't designed for water rescues. Unlike the Coast Guard's specialized aircraft, it couldn't land on water or hover to pick up survivors. But Sarah had a plan, one that would require precision flying beyond anything she had ever attempted. Coast Guard Rescue 1. This is King Air 74 Charlie. I'm going to attempt to drop rescue supplies to the survivors. I have medical kits, emergency flares, and additional flotation devices. Request you vector any available surface vessels to my position. King Air 74 Charlie, nearest Coast Guard cutter is 4 hours away. Hurricane conditions make surface rescue extremely dangerous. You're on your own out there. Sarah opened the aircraft's cargo door, fighting against the hurricane force. Winds that immediately tried to tear it from its hinges. The noise was deafening, and the rain drove into the cabin like bullets. She had secured several emergency supply packages near the door, each one containing medical supplies, food, water, and emergency flares. Her first target was a life raft, containing what appeared to be a family with small children. The raft was being overwhelmed by the massive waves, and Sarah could see that it was beginning to take on water. She descended to 100 feet, fighting tremendous turbulence and wind shear that threatened to slam the aircraft into the ocean. The timing had to be perfect. She had to account for the wind speed, the aircraft's forward velocity, and the movement of the life raft on the waves. Too early, and the supplies would miss by hundreds of yards. Too late, and they would be destroyed by the impact. Now. Sarah shouted over the noise of the storm, pushing the first supply package out the door. She watched as it tumbled through the air, its bright orange parachute deploying automatically. The package hit the water 30 feet from the life raft, close enough for the survivors to swim to it if they were strong enough. One by one, Sarah dropped supplies to the scattered life rafts. Each approach was a battle against the elements, requiring split-second timing and absolute concentration. The aircraft was being battered by winds that exceeded its design limits, and she could feel the airframe flexing under the strain on her. Seventh supply drop, disaster struck. A massive downdraft caught the King Air, just as Sarah was beginning her approach to a cluster of 3 life rafts. The aircraft dropped like a stone, falling 800 feet in seconds before Sarah could regain control. The sudden descent caused several unsecured items in the cabin to become projectiles, and she felt something strike her shoulder with tremendous force. Pain shot through her left arm, and she realized she had been injured. Blood was soaking through her flight suit, and her left arm was nearly useless. But she couldn't stop now. There were still hundreds of people in the water, and she was their only hope. King Air 74 Charlie, this is Coast Guard Rescue 1. We lost you on radar for several minutes. What is your status? Coast Guard Rescue 1, I'm still operational but have sustained some damage. Continuing rescue operations. Sarah didn't mention her injury. She knew that if the Coast Guard became aware of her condition, they would order her to return to base immediately. She couldn't let that happen, not when so many lives were at stake. As she continued her supply drops, Sarah began to notice something troubling. Several of the life rafts were beginning to sink or capsize in the massive waves. The survivors were being thrown into the water, where their chances of survival were minimal. She had to do something more than just drop supplies. That's when she saw him. A young boy, no more than 10 years old, clinging to a piece of debris. About 200 yards from the nearest life raft. He was alone in the water, his small body being tossed around by the waves like a rag doll. Sarah could see that he was weakening, his grip on the debris beginning to slip, making a decision that would have terrified any sane pilot. Sarah descended to just 50 feet above the water. The aircraft was now below the wave tops, flying through a canyon of water that rose and fell around her. One wrong move, one moment of inattention, and the King Air would be swallowed by the ocean. Using the aircraft's powerful landing lights, Sarah illuminated the area around the boy. The lights cut through the rain and spray, creating a beacon that the nearby life raft could see. She began flying in a tight circle around the child, using the aircraft's position to guide the survivors in the life raft toward him. The rescue took nearly 20 minutes. Sarah had to maintain her circular flight pattern while fighting hurricane-force winds and massive turbulence. Her injured arm was screaming in pain, and she was becoming dizzy from blood loss. But she held her position, using the aircraft as a beacon to guide the rescue. Finally, she saw the survivors in the life raft reach the boy and pull him to safety. The moment was both triumphant and heartbreaking. She had saved one life, but there were still hundreds of people scattered across the storm-tossed ocean. As Sarah climbed back to a safer altitude, she noticed that her fuel gauges were approaching the halfway mark. She had been flying for 3 hours, and the storm was showing no signs of weakening. She would have to make a critical decision: continue the rescue operations and risk running out of fuel, or return to base to refuel and potentially abandon the survivors to their fate. The decision was made for her when she spotted something that made her blood run cold. A large group of survivors, at least 50 people, were clinging to the overturned hull of a life raft. The raft had capsized in the massive waves, and the people were exposed to the full fury of the hurricane. They had no protection from the wind and rain, and Sarah could see that several were already unconscious. This was the moment that would define her career, her life, and her legacy. She could play it safe and return to base, or she could risk everything to save as many lives as possible. Looking down at those desperate souls fighting against impossible odds, Sarah made a choice that would either vindicate her completely or destroy her forever. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the controls, her injured arm sending waves of pain through her body with every movement. Below her, 50 people clung desperately to the overturned life raft, their strength visibly waning as the massive waves crashed over them repeatedly. The orange safety equipment that was supposed to save their lives had become their prison, offering no protection from the hurricane's fury. The fuel situation was critical. Sarah's calculations showed that she had perhaps 30 minutes of flying time remaining before she would be forced to land, whether she reached an airport or not. Returning to Key West would be the smart choice, the safe choice, the choice that would ensure she lived to see another day. But as she watched the survivors below being battered by the storm, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible to the Federal Aviation Administration officials who had deemed her unfit to fly. She would stay until her fuel ran out, using every last drop to save as many lives as possible. Coast Guard Rescue 1, This is King Air 74 Charlie. I have a large group of survivors clinging to an overturned life raft. They're not going to survive much longer in these conditions. I'm going to attempt something that's never been tried before. King Air 74 Charlie, what are your intentions? Sarah's voice was steady, despite the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. I'm going to try to flip the life raft back over using the aircraft's prop wash. It's dangerous, but it's their only chance. The silence on the radio was deafening. What Sarah was proposing was beyond dangerous. It was suicidal. Flying a twin-engine aircraft at wave-top level in hurricane conditions, trying to use the propeller wash to manipulate an object in the water, was something that had never been attempted. The margin for error was zero. King Air 74 Charlie. Negative. Do not attempt that maneuver. The risk is too great. But Sarah was already descending, her aircraft dropping toward the churning ocean like a guided missile. She had made her choice, and no amount of radio chatter would change her mind. The survivors below didn't have time for bureaucratic discussions about acceptable risk levels. At 30 feet above the water, Sarah began her approach to the overturned life raft. The aircraft was now flying through the spray, kicked up by the massive waves, and the windscreen was completely obscured by salt water and foam. She was flying entirely on instruments, using her radar altimeter to maintain altitude and her GPS to navigate. The first pass was a disaster. The aircraft's prop wash hit the life raft, but instead of flipping it over, it simply pushed it sideways into a massive wave. Several survivors were thrown into the water, and Sarah watched in horror as they disappeared beneath the churning surface. I killed them, she whispered to herself, pulling up sharply to avoid a wave that rose like a mountain in front of her. I just killed them. But as she circled back, Sarah saw something that gave her hope. The survivors who had been thrown into the water were being pulled back to the life raft by their companions. They were still alive, still fighting, still refusing to give up. On her second pass, Sarah adjusted her approach. Instead of hitting the life raft directly, she aimed for the water just to one side, creating a wall of turbulence that would roll the raft over without destroying it. The maneuver required precision flying that pushed both the aircraft and its pilot beyond their limits. The prop wash hit the water with tremendous force, creating a miniature tsunami that lifted the life raft and rolled it over. For a moment, Sarah thought she had succeeded, but then she saw the raft begin to flip back over as another massive wave crashed into it. Third time's the charm, Sarah muttered through gritted teeth, banking the aircraft for another approach. Her fuel gauge was now showing dangerously low levels, and she could feel the aircraft becoming less responsive as the tanks emptied. This time, Sarah timed her approach perfectly. As the life raft rode up the face of a massive wave, she hit it with a carefully controlled blast of prop wash that flipped it over and wedged it between two wave crests. The raft stayed upright, and Sarah could see the survivors scrambling to get inside its protective canopy. Coast Guard Rescue 1, this is King Air 74 Charlie. I've successfully flipped the life raft. Survivors are now in a protected position, but I'm running critically low on fuel. I need to find a place to land immediately. King Air 74 Charlie. Nearest airport is Nassau International, bearing 270 degrees, distance 95 nautical miles. Current weather conditions show winds gusting to 120 knots with zero visibility. Sarah's heart sank. Nassau was too far away, and even if she could reach it, landing in those conditions would be impossible. She had perhaps 15 minutes of fuel remaining, and the nearest land was still 40 miles away. But then she remembered something from her pre-flight briefing. There was a small private airstrip on Cat Island, a narrow strip of concrete that wealthy tourists used for their private jets. It was closer than Nassau, but landing there in hurricane conditions would be like threading a needle in a tornado. Coast Guard Rescue 1, I'm going to attempt a landing at Cat Island Private Airstrip. If I don't make it, Please tell my family that I died doing what I loved. King Air 74 Charlie, negative. Do not attempt landing at Cat Island. The strip is too short for your aircraft, and weather conditions are beyond limits. But Sarah was already turning toward Cat Island, her aircraft fighting headwinds that reduced her ground speed to less than 100 knots. Every mile was a battle, every minute a victory against the forces of nature that seemed determined to bring her down. As she approached Cat Island, Sarah could see the airstrip through brief breaks in the clouds. The runway was indeed short, perhaps 3,000 feet long, and it was surrounded by palm trees that were being whipped around by the hurricane-force winds. The approach would have to be perfect. Too high, and she would overshoot the runway. Too low, and she would crash into the trees, with her fuel gauge reading empty and her left arm nearly useless from her earlier injury. Sarah lined up for what she knew would be the most challenging landing of her career. The aircraft was being buffeted by winds that exceeded its design limits, and she could feel the engines beginning to sputter as they consumed the last drops of fuel. "Come on, baby," she whispered to the aircraft, willing it to stay aloft just a few more minutes. "We've come this far together. Don't quit on me now." The landing was a miracle of skill and determination. Sarah touched down at the very beginning of the runway, her aircraft slamming into the concrete with tremendous force. The impact was so violent that it shattered the landing gear, but the aircraft stayed on the runway, skidding to a stop just feet from the end. As Sarah shut down the engines and silence filled the cockpit for the first time in hours, she realized that she had done the impossible. She had flown into the heart of a Category 4 hurricane, saved multiple lives, and lived to tell about it. The Federal Aviation Administration had declared her unfit to fly, but she had just proven that sometimes the most important flights are the ones that take you beyond the boundaries of official approval. But her story was far from over. As she sat in the damaged cockpit, bleeding and exhausted, Sarah knew that her actions would once again put her at odds with the aviation authorities. She had violated numerous regulations, exceeded aircraft limitations, and operated without proper authorization. The same system that had grounded her for saving lives would undoubtedly punish her again for this rescue mission. Yet as she thought about the 50 people who were now safely in their life raft, the young boy who had been pulled from the water, and the dozens of other survivors who had received life-saving supplies, Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had proven that sometimes doing the right thing requires breaking the rules, and that the true measure of a pilot isn't found in regulation manuals but in the courage to act when lives are at stake. What she didn't know was that this rescue would become the catalyst for the most important fight of her life, a battle that would determine whether heroism or bureaucracy would prevail in the skies above. The hurricane passed over Cat Island like a freight train, its eye wall bringing with it a brief moment of eerie calm before the backside of the storm unleashed its fury. Sarah remained in the damaged King Air throughout the night, her injured arm throbbing with pain as she listened to the wind howl around the aircraft. The small terminal building had been destroyed, and debris flew past the cockpit windows like missiles. As dawn broke over the storm-ravaged island, Sarah finally emerged from the aircraft to survey the damage. The King Air was a wreck. Its landing gear had collapsed, the propellers were bent, and the fuselage was dented and scraped from the violent landing. But it had done its job, carrying her safely through the hurricane and back to land. The island's small population had weathered the storm in reinforced shelters, and as they emerged to begin the cleanup process, they were amazed to find a damaged aircraft on their runway. Word spread quickly about the pilot who had landed during the hurricane, and soon Sarah found herself surrounded by curious islanders who wanted to hear her story. "You're the pilot who flew into Isabella?" asked Dr. Maria Gonzalez, the island's only physician, as she examined Sarah's injured arm. "The Coast Guard has been trying to reach you on the radio all night. They said you saved dozens of lives out there." Sarah winced as the doctor cleaned and bandaged her wounds. I just did what any pilot would do. There were people in the water who needed help. Any pilot? Dr. Gonzalez shook her head. Lady, I've lived on this island for 20 years, and I've never seen anyone crazy enough to land here in hurricane conditions. You're either the bravest pilot I've ever met, or the most foolish. Probably both, Sarah admitted with a tired smile. The Coast Guard helicopter arrived 3 hours later, its crew eager to debrief Sarah about her rescue mission. Commander James Morrison, the mission leader, approached her with a mixture of admiration and concern. Captain Mitchell, I have to say, what you did out there was both heroic and completely insane. You saved at least 23 lives, possibly more, but you also violated every safety protocol in the book. Sarah looked out at the ocean, where rescue vessels were still searching for survivors. How many people did we save in total? Final count is 681 survivors out of 700 passengers and crew. 19 people are still missing and presumed dead. Without your intervention, that number would have been much higher. The weight of those numbers settled on Sarah's shoulders. 19 families would never see their loved ones again, but 681 people would return home to their families because she had chosen to fly into the hurricane. It was a trade-off that would haunt her for years to come. Commander, I know I'm going to face consequences for my actions. The FAA will probably try to take away what's left of my license. But I want you to know that I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Commander Morrison nodded slowly. I understand, Captain. And for what it's worth, you have the respect of every Coast Guard pilot who was out there yesterday. We saw what you did, and we know it took extraordinary courage. The helicopter ride back to Key West was quiet, with Sarah lost in thought about the events of the past 24 hours. She had proven to herself and to the world that she was capable of extraordinary things, but she knew that her actions would be viewed differently by the aviation authorities. To them, she was still the reckless pilot who couldn't follow orders. Upon landing at the Coast Guard base, Sarah was immediately whisked away for medical treatment and debriefing. The media had already gotten wind of the story, and reporters were gathered outside the base, eager to interview the pilot who had risked everything to save strangers. Hurricane Hero saved 681 lives, read one headline. Banned pilot proves system wrong, declared another. The story was spreading across social media with videos of Sarah's rescue mission that had been captured by Coast Guard aircraft. The public was fascinated by the tale of a pilot who had been deemed unfit to fly, but had performed one of the most daring rescues in aviation history, but not everyone was impressed. Within hours of the rescue, the Federal Aviation Administration issued a statement condemning Sarah's actions and announcing that they would be conducting a full investigation. The same bureaucrats who had grounded her for saving lives were now preparing to punish her for saving even more lives. Ms. Mitchell's actions, while well-intentioned, represent a dangerous precedent, stated FAA Administrator Robert Chun. Aviation safety depends on pilots following established protocols, not taking matters into their own hands. We will be reviewing this incident thoroughly and taking appropriate action. Sarah watched the press conference from her hospital bed, her arm in a sling and her body exhausted from the ordeal. She felt a familiar sense of frustration and anger at the system that seemed more concerned with bureaucratic compliance than with human life. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her former attorney, Maria Santos. Sarah, I'm seeing the news reports. This is exactly what we need to appeal your case. The public is on your side, and your actions prove that the FAA was wrong about your fitness to fly. Are you ready to fight them again? Sarah stared at the message for a long time before responding. The thought of another legal battle was exhausting, but she realized that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every pilot who had ever been unfairly grounded, every aviation professional who had been punished for doing the right thing, and every person who believed that sometimes breaking the rules was the only way to serve a higher purpose. "Yes," she typed back, "I'm ready to fight." The next morning, Sarah was released from the hospital to find hundreds of supporters gathered outside. Pilots, passengers she had saved over the years, and ordinary citizens who had been inspired by her story had come to show their support. They held signs reading, "Heroes don't need permission," and "Sarah Mitchell, real American hero." As she walked through the crowd, Sarah was approached by a young girl, no more than 8 years old, who reminded her of herself at that age. "Are you the pilot who saved all those people?" the girl asked, her eyes wide with admiration. Sarah knelt down to the girl's level. "I'm just a pilot who believes that sometimes you have to do what's right, even when people tell you it's wrong." The girl smiled. "I want to be a pilot too, just like you." In that moment, Sarah realized that her story wasn't just about one dramatic rescue. It was about inspiring the next generation of aviators to believe that courage and compassion were more important than bureaucratic compliance. She had become a symbol of everything that was right about aviation, even as the system continued to treat her as everything that was wrong. But this time, she wouldn't face the bureaucratic machine alone. She had the power of public opinion and the weight of undeniable heroism on her side. Federal Aviation Administration's investigation into Sarah's hurricane rescue began within days of her return to Key West, but this time the atmosphere was markedly different. Teams of investigators descended on the island like a bureaucratic hurricane, determined to find evidence of wrongdoing in what the rest of the world saw as heroic action. But they were working under the intense scrutiny of global media attention and overwhelming public support for Sarah, lead investigator. Thomas Bradley was a career FAA official who had built his reputation on strict enforcement of regulations. He arrived at the Key West airport with a team of technical experts, lawyers, and accident reconstruction specialists, all tasked with dissecting every aspect of Sarah's rescue mission. But unlike her previous hearing, this investigation was being conducted in the full glare of international attention. "Ms. Mitchell," Bradley began during their first interview, his tone formal and accusatory, "you operated an aircraft in weather conditions that exceeded its certification limits. You flew below minimum safe altitudes. You conducted unauthorized aerial operations without proper clearances. And you landed at an airport that was officially closed due to weather conditions. These are serious violations that put lives at risk." Sarah sat across from him in the sterile conference room, her lawyer Maria Santos beside her. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was being investigated for risking lives by the same agency that had grounded her for supposedly risking lives. But this time, she had something she didn't have before: the unwavering support of the people whose lives she had saved. "Mr. Bradley," Sarah replied, her voice steady, "I saved 681 people. That's 681 families who still have their loved ones because I chose to act. How exactly did my actions put lives at risk?" Bradley shuffled through his papers, clearly uncomfortable with the question and the knowledge that every word of this interview would likely end up in the media. "The issue isn't the outcome, Ms. Mitchell. The issue is the precedent. If we allow pilots to disregard safety regulations whenever they deem it necessary, the entire aviation system becomes compromised." "So you're saying that following regulations is more important than saving lives?" "I'm saying that regulations exist for a reason. They're based on decades of experience and analysis by aviation safety experts. When pilots start making unilateral decisions about which rules to follow, people die." The investigation continued for weeks, with Bradley's team analyzing every aspect of Sarah's flight. They studied weather reports, examined the damaged aircraft, and interviewed witnesses. They brought in aviation psychologists to assess Sarah's mental state and technical experts to determine whether her actions had been reckless or heroic. But the investigation faced a unique challenge. Public opinion was overwhelmingly on Sarah's side. The survivors of the Caribbean Star had organized a petition demanding that the FAA recognize Sarah as a hero rather than prosecute her as a rule breaker. The petition gained over 100,000 signatures in its first week. Captain Robert Hayes, Sarah's former co-pilot who had testified against her in the original hearing, found himself in an uncomfortable position. The media had tracked him down, and he was being asked to defend his earlier characterization of Sarah as an unstable pilot. "I stand by my previous testimony," Hayes told a reporter from Aviation Week. "Captain Mitchell has always been impulsive and unpredictable. The fact that her latest stunt worked out doesn't change the fact that she's a risk to aviation safety." But Hayes' words rang hollow in the face of Sarah's obvious heroism. Other pilots began coming forward with their own stories of Sarah's professionalism and skill. The narrative that the FAA had carefully constructed about her being unfit to fly was crumbling under the weight of evidence to the contrary. Dr. Patricia Williams, an aviation psychology professor at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, was brought in by Sarah's legal team to provide expert testimony. Her analysis painted a very different picture of Sarah's actions. "What we see in Captain Mitchell's behavior is not impulsiveness or recklessness," Dr. Williams explained during a press conference. "We see measured decision-making under extreme pressure." She accurately assessed the risks and benefits of her actions and made choices that prioritized human life over bureaucratic compliance. "This is exactly the kind of judgment we want in our pilots." The international aviation community was also taking notice. The International Federation of Airline Pilots Associations issued a statement supporting Sarah and criticizing the FAA's actions. Similar statements came from pilot organizations in Canada, Europe, and Australia. "The FAA's persecution of Captain Mitchell sends a chilling message to pilots worldwide," said Captain Jean-Pierre Dubois, president of the European Cockpit Association. "It suggests that following orders is more important than saving lives. This is a dangerous precedent that threatens the very essence of what it means to be a pilot." As the investigation dragged on, Sarah found herself at the center of a global debate about aviation safety, regulatory authority, and the role of individual judgment in life or death situations. Aviation blogs dissected every aspect of her rescue mission, comparing it to other famous instances of pilots breaking rules to save lives. The case was becoming a watershed moment for the aviation industry. On one side stood the regulatory establishment, arguing that rules existed for good reasons and that allowing pilots to ignore them would lead to chaos. On the other side were pilots, passengers, and aviation enthusiasts who believed that rigid adherence to regulations should never supersede the fundamental duty to preserve human life. Sarah's story was being taught in aviation schools around the world, not as an example of what not to do, but as a case study in moral courage and exceptional airmanship. Student pilots were analyzing her decision-making process, studying her flight path through the hurricane, and learning about the split-second choices that had saved hundreds of lives. The pressure on the FAA was mounting. Congressional representatives were calling for hearings, and the aviation industry was watching to see how the agency would handle the most high-profile case in its history. The decision they made would set a precedent that would affect aviation safety and pilot discretion for decades to come. Meanwhile, Sarah continued her work as a flight instructor, teaching young pilots not just the technical aspects of flying, but the importance of moral courage and decisive action. Her students hung on her every word, knowing they were learning from someone who had faced the ultimate test of a pilot's skill and character. "Flying is about more than just following checklists and procedures," she told her students. "It's about making decisions under pressure, about taking responsibility for the lives in your hands, and about having the courage to do what's right, even when the system tells you it's wrong." As the investigation entered its third month, Sarah knew that the FAA FAA faced a difficult choice. They could continue to pursue charges against her, risking public backlash and international condemnation. Or they could acknowledge that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism come from those who are willing to break the rules in service of a higher purpose. The question was whether the federal bureaucracy had the wisdom to recognize the difference between reckless rule-breaking and heroic rule-transcending. Sarah's fate and the future of aviation safety hung in the balance. But this time, she wasn't fighting alone. She had the power of truth, the weight of evidence, and the voice of the people on her side. The turning point came on a humid Tuesday morning in October, when the National Transportation Safety Board released their independent analysis of Sarah's rescue mission. Unlike the FAA's investigation, which focused on regulatory violations, the NTSB examined the technical and decision-making aspects of her flight through Hurricane Isabella. The report would become one of the most significant documents in modern aviation history. Captain Mitchell's actions during the Caribbean Star rescue represent exceptional airmanship under extreme conditions. The NTSB report concluded, her decision-making process was sound, her risk assessment was accurate, and her execution of the rescue operations was exemplary. Without her intervention, the loss of life would have been catastrophic. The report went on to detail the sophisticated flight planning that Sarah had conducted in her head during the rescue. She had calculated fuel consumption, analyzed weather patterns, and assessed aircraft performance limitations while flying in conditions that would have challenged even the most advanced autopilot systems. The pilot demonstrated an intuitive understanding of aircraft performance and weather dynamics that allowed her to operate safely in conditions that would have been fatal for less experienced aviators. The report noted, her actions saved an estimated 200 additional lives beyond what conventional rescue operations could have achieved. The NTSB's findings sent shockwaves through the aviation community. Here was the government's premier aviation safety agency, directly contradicting the FAA's characterization of Sarah as a reckless pilot. The technical analysis showed that her flying had been precise, calculated, and extraordinarily skillful. Dr. Michael Harrison, the FAA, a psychologist who had originally declared Sarah unfit to fly, found himself under intense scrutiny. His evaluation methods were being questioned by his peers, and several of his previous fitness determinations were being appealed based on apparent bias and inadequate assessment procedures. Dr. Harrison's psychological evaluation appears to have been influenced by gender bias and preconceived notions about female pilots, wrote Dr. Sarah Chun, a leading aviation psychologist, in a scathing article in the Journal of Aviation Psychology. His focus on emotional stability and authority acceptance reflects outdated attitudes that have no place in modern aviation safety assessment. The pressure on the FAA reached a breaking point when Senator Elizabeth Walsh, chair of the Senate Aviation Subcommittee, announced that she would be holding hearings on the Sarah Mitchell case. Senator Walsh, a former Air Force pilot herself, had been following the story closely and was deeply troubled by the agency's treatment of Sarah. The FAA's persecution of Captain Mitchell represents everything that's wrong with our regulatory system, Senator Walsh said during a press conference. We have a hero who saved hundreds of lives being treated like a criminal by the very agency that should be celebrating her courage and skill. The hearings were scheduled for November 15th, just 3 days before the one-year anniversary of Sarah's original grounding. The timing was symbolic. It would be exactly 1 year since the FAA had declared her unfit to fly, and now she would have the opportunity to tell her story to the nation. As the hearing date approached, Sarah found herself at the center of a media frenzy. News crews followed her daily routine. Pilots from around the world sent messages of support, and the survivors of the Caribbean Star organized a rally in Washington, D.C., demanding that the FAA recognize her as a hero. Thomas Bradley, The lead FAA investigator was also feeling the pressure. His investigation had turned up no evidence of reckless behavior or poor judgment on Sarah's part. In fact, the technical analysis showed that her flying had been virtually flawless under impossible conditions. He was being asked to prosecute someone who had clearly acted heroically. 3 days before the hearing, Bradley made a decision that would define his career. He requested a private meeting with FAA Administrator Robert Chen to discuss the investigation's findings. "Sir," Bradley began, sitting across from Chen in his Washington office, "I've spent 6 months trying to build a case against Captain Mitchell, and I can't do it. The evidence doesn't support the charges. She's not a reckless pilot. She's one of the most skilled aviators I've ever encountered." Chen leaned back in his chair, clearly frustrated. "Tom, we can't just let pilots ignore regulations whenever they feel like it. Where does it end?" "With respect, sir, this isn't about a pilot ignoring regulations. This is about a pilot making life or death decisions under extreme circumstances. The NTSB report makes it clear that she saved hundreds of lives. If we prosecute her, we're sending a message that bureaucratic compliance is more important than human life." The meeting lasted for 2 hours, with Bradley presenting the evidence that had emerged from his investigation. Sarah's actions had been documented by Coast Guard aircraft, analyzed by aviation experts, and validated by the survivors themselves. There was no credible case to be made against her. That evening, Administrator Chen called an emergency meeting of the FAA senior leadership. The agency faced a choice: continue to pursue charges against Sarah and risk a public relations disaster, or acknowledge that they had been wrong about her fitness to fly. The decision came down to politics and public perception. The FAA was already facing criticism from Congress about its handling of various safety issues, and the Sarah Mitchell case had become a symbol of bureaucratic overreach. Continuing to prosecute her would only invite more scrutiny and criticism. November 12, 3 days before the scheduled hearing, the FAA issued a surprising statement. After a thorough investigation, the Federal Aviation Administration has determined that Captain Sarah Mitchell's actions during the Caribbean Star rescue were consistent with the highest standards of aviation safety and airmanship. The agency will not be pursuing any enforcement action related to this incident. The statement stopped short of fully vindicating Sarah, but it represented a significant retreat from the agency's earlier position. More importantly, it opened the door for her to appeal her original grounding and potentially return to commercial aviation. Sarah learned about the FAA's decision while teaching a flight lesson to one of her students. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria Santos. "It's over. They're dropping the case. You won." For the first time in months, Sarah felt a sense of relief. The investigation that had hung over her like a dark cloud was finally over. She was free to move forward with her life and her career, knowing that she had been vindicated by the evidence and the courage of those who had stood up for her. But the victory was bittersweet. The system that had grounded her for saving lives had only backed down when faced with overwhelming public pressure and political consequences. The fundamental problems with aviation bureaucracy remained unchanged, and Sarah knew that other pilots would face similar challenges in the future. However, this victory had proven something important: that truth and heroism could triumph over bureaucratic inertia when the people demanded justice. Sarah's case had become a rallying cry for pilots worldwide and a turning point in the relationship between aviation authorities and the aviators they regulated. 6 months after the FAA dropped their investigation, Sarah found herself standing in the same hearing room where she had been grounded 2 years earlier. But this time, she wasn't facing charges. She was there to appeal her original grounding and fight for the restoration of her commercial pilot's license. The room that had once felt like a tribunal now buzzed with anticipation and hope. The hearing panel was different this time. composed of younger officials who had been chosen specifically for their technical expertise, rather than their bureaucratic seniority. The atmosphere was markedly different from her first hearing, with a sense of respect and professionalism that had been absent before. The media presence was overwhelming, with reporters from aviation publications and major news networks covering what many considered the most important aviation hearing in decades. "Captain Mitchell," the panel chair began, "we're here to review the circumstances of your original license suspension and to determine whether the evidence supports the continued restriction of your commercial flying privileges." Sarah's legal team, led by Maria Santos, presented a comprehensive case that systematically dismantled the arguments that had been used to ground her. They brought in expert witnesses, presented testimony from passengers and crew members, and highlighted the technical analysis that had vindicated her actions during the hurricane rescue. Dr. Patricia Williams, the aviation psychology professor who had become an expert witness in the case, delivered particularly damaging testimony about the original psychological evaluation. "The assessment conducted by Dr. Harrison was deeply flawed," she testified. "It relied on outdated gender stereotypes and failed to account for the complex decision-making skills that Captain Mitchell demonstrated throughout her career. His conclusions about her emotional instability are not supported by any credible psychological evidence." The hearing also featured testimony from Captain James Torres, the charter pilot who had initially refused to fly into the hurricane, but had later changed his mind about Sarah's actions. "I was wrong about Captain Mitchell," Torres admitted. "I thought she was crazy for flying into Isabella, but I've had time to study what she did out there. It wasn't reckless, it was the most skilled flying I've ever seen. She saved hundreds of lives, and she did it with a level of precision that most pilots couldn't achieve in perfect conditions." But the most powerful testimony came from the survivors themselves. Emily Rodriguez, a mother of two who had been on the Caribbean Star with her children, spoke through tears about the moment she saw Sarah's aircraft appear through the storm. "We had given up hope," Rodriguez said. "We were clinging to that life raft, watching people around us disappear into the waves, and we thought we were going to die. Then we saw this plane flying through the hurricane, and we knew someone was trying to save us. Captain Mitchell risked her life for strangers. She's a hero, and the fact that she was punished for it is a disgrace." The hearing lasted 3 days, with testimony from dozens of witnesses and experts. The evidence was overwhelming. Sarah was not only fit to fly, but she was an exceptional pilot who had demonstrated remarkable skill and judgment under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. On the final day, Sarah herself took the stand. She spoke about her lifelong passion for aviation, her commitment to safety, and her belief that pilots had a moral obligation to put human life above bureaucratic compliance. "I've never regretted my decision to fly into that hurricane," she concluded. "I would do it again tomorrow if it meant saving lives. That's what being a pilot means to me, using your skills to help others, to rise above the ordinary and do something extraordinary when the situation demands it." The panel deliberated for less than an hour before returning with their decision. The chair's voice was steady and clear. "After careful consideration of all evidence presented, this panel finds that Captain Sarah Mitchell is fully qualified to hold a commercial pilot's license, and that her previous suspension was not justified by the evidence. Her license is hereby restored, effective immediately." The courtroom erupted in applause, with supporters who had filled the gallery cheering and crying. Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. After 2 years of fighting, she was finally free to return to the sky as a commercial pilot. But Sarah's victory was about more than just her personal vindication. It represented a fundamental shift in how the aviation industry viewed pilot judgment and authority. The case had sparked important conversations about the balance between regulatory compliance and moral courage. and it had inspired a new generation of pilots to believe that doing the right thing was more important than following the rules. Major airlines began reaching out to Sarah within hours of the hearing's conclusion. Several offered her captain positions, and one even proposed to make her the face of their new safety campaign. But Sarah had different plans. Instead of returning to commercial aviation, she established the Sarah Mitchell Foundation for Aviation Safety, an organization dedicated to supporting pilots who faced unfair treatment from regulatory agencies. The foundation provided legal assistance, expert testimony, and public advocacy for aviators who found themselves in situations similar to hers. There are pilots all over the world who are being punished for doing the right thing, Sarah explained. At the foundation's launch event, my case got attention because of the dramatic circumstances, but there are countless other aviators who have faced similar challenges without the benefit of public support. We need to stand up for them. The foundation's first case involved a cargo pilot who had been grounded for deviating from his flight plan to avoid a collision with a military aircraft. The second case involved a female pilot who had been subjected to discriminatory treatment by her employer and regulatory officials. In each case, the foundation provided the resources and expertise needed to fight bureaucratic overreach. Sarah also returned to teaching, but on a much larger scale. She developed a curriculum for aviation schools that emphasized ethical decision-making and moral courage alongside technical skills. Her classes, which she taught at universities around the world, became some of the most popular and respected in aviation education. Flying is a privilege and a responsibility, she would tell her students. We hold people's lives in our hands every time we take off. That responsibility doesn't end when we encounter situations that aren't covered in the manual. Sometimes, the most important decisions are the ones that require us to go beyond the rules and do what's right. 5 years after the hurricane rescue, Sarah was invited to speak at the International Civil Aviation Organization Safety Conference in Montreal. Standing before an audience of aviation officials from around the world, she reflected on the journey that had brought her there. The system tried to silence me because I chose to save lives instead of following procedures, she said. But the real lesson of this story isn't about one pilot or one rescue. It's about the importance of moral courage in aviation and the need for regulations that support rather than suppress the human judgment that keeps us safe. The speech received a standing ovation from the international audience, and Sarah's words were quoted in aviation publications around the world. She had become not just a hero of a single rescue mission, but a symbol of everything that was best about aviation: courage, skill, and an unwavering commitment to protecting human life. As she left the stage that day, Sarah thought about the young girl who had approached her outside the hospital 2 years earlier, the one who had said she wanted to be a pilot just like you. She hoped that girl was still pursuing her dreams, and that she would someday find herself in a position to make the same choice that Sarah had made in the eye of the hurricane, to put human life above everything else, no matter the cost. Sky was calling, and Sarah Mitchell had answered with everything she had. Her legacy would live on in every pilot who chose courage over compliance, every aviator who put humanity before bureaucracy, and every person who believed that sometimes the most important flights are the ones that take you beyond the boundaries of what's officially allowed. Sarah's story had proven that one person, armed with skill, courage, and an unwavering moral compass, could change an entire industry. She had transformed from a grounded pilot into a global symbol of heroism, and her influence would be felt in aviation for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.